If you look directly into the eyes of the most perfect man in history, you'll notice something unsettling. He's cross-eyed. Seriously, his left eye looks straight ahead, while his right eye strays to the side. If you lower your gaze just a bit, his right hand will look like it belongs to some kind of mutant. It's massive, completely disproportionate. The fingers are too long, the knuckles are huge, and the veins on the back of his hand bulge as if hydraulic hoses were running right under his skin. And if you walk around to the back, you'll find a strange, empty pit between his right shoulder blade and spine. There's a whole anatomical muscle completely missing. For 500 years, humanity has been left breathless with admiration looking at this statue. Gallery tour guides constantly drone on about the absolute triumph of beauty. But let's be honest, a 26-year-old kid named Michelangelo Buonarroti just went ahead and left blatant, glaring defects on his ultimate masterpiece. What is this? The blunder of a tired amateur rushing to hand in an order? Or are we looking at a masterclass in mathematical calculation, a political provocation, and a bold psychological thriller encrypted into a block of white stone? Let's crack this code and see how one audacious Florentine completely flipped our understanding of what the human body can do when it's carved out of solid rock. Every time you see David on souvenir magnets, postcards, or trendy social media pages, it feels like this story must have started in a sun-drenched workshop, with a genius in a spotless apron gently tapping away at a perfect block of pristine Carrara marble. The reality was a lot dirtier, more toxic, and far more hopeless. Let's flash back to Florence in the year 1501. In the courtyard of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, a massive, ugly monolith has been rotting under the pouring rain for nearly 40 years. Locals call it the Giant. It was a 17-foot block of marble that the city authorities bought for an insane amount of money back in the middle of the previous century. The plan was to turn it into a biblical prophet to decorate the cathedral's roof, but the project was cursed. The first sculptor, Agostino di Duccio, had barely started working when he managed to gouge a deep, senseless hole right between the legs of the future statue. Panicked, he dropped his tools and vanished. 10 years later, another master, Antonio Rossellino, took a crack at the stone. He stared at the hole, tried to fix something, chipped away a few more critical chunks of rock, grew terrified of how fragile the stone was, and walked away from the contract too. In the end, the marble was simply abandoned in the backyard. For 40 years, it soaked in the rain, grew black mould, cracked during winter frosts, and slowly turned into an expensive, useless pile of junk. The stone was considered dead, ruined. The city officials were desperate. They started looking for anyone who would risk carving at least something decent out of this leftover scrap. They put together a whole committee. They even called in Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo showed up, looked at the narrow, flat profile of the stone, stared at the horrific gouges left by the previous sculptors, scoffed in disgust, and declared the material hopeless. He suggested scrapping the whole idea and making something out of bronze instead. And that's when Michelangelo steps onto the scene. He's 26. He's young, incredibly ambitious, dirt poor, and has the temperament of an explosive device. Imagine how insane that was. The stone wasn't just ruined, it was too thin. The previous carvers had shaved it down so much that the future statue literally lacked thickness in the chest and hips. It wasn't just a challenge to art, it was a challenge to the laws of physics. If Michelangelo had made a mistake by even a single centimetre, if his chisel had gone just a fraction too deep into the rock, the entire 5-ton behemoth would have collapsed under its own weight, burying both the young man's ambitions and the remains of the city budget underneath. So, what does Michelangelo do? He pulls off his first genius-producing move. He demands a high wooden fence be built around the block of marble. Nobody is allowed to see him work. No onlookers, no backseat drivers, no established masters. Especially not Leonardo, who was just waiting for his young rival to fail. For 2 years, Michelangelo lives behind that fence. He works like a man possessed, strapping candles to his head so he wouldn't have to stop even at night, when Florence plunged into pitch darkness. When the fence was finally torn down, All of Florence was in total shock. But not because they saw a pretty biblical picture. People saw something that broke every single rule of the game. To understand why the crowd outside Michelangelo's workshop froze in shock, you have to remember how David was usually depicted up to that point. David is a character from the Old Testament, a young shepherd boy who faced off against Goliath, a giant warrior clad in iron armor, with nothing but a sling. David won. He slung a stone straight into the giant's forehead, then walked over and cut off his head with his own sword. Every sculptor before Michelangelo, like the great Donatello or Verrocchio, sculpted David as a triumphant victor. He was always an elegant, pretty youth standing relaxed, leaning on a sword. And at his feet, without fail, lay the massive, bloody, severed head of Goliath. The narrative was simple. The battle is over. The enemy is defeated. And the little boy won thanks to divine intervention. It's a beautiful fairy tale story about a miracle. Michelangelo throws out the head of Goliath. He removes the sword. He wipes away even the slightest hint of a miracle. Our David is completely naked. He has no armor. A sling is barely visible in his left hand pressed against his shoulder, and a small stone is clutched in his right hand, hanging low by his side. Look at this contrast. We're used to seeing stillness in statues, but what we have here is a psychological thriller. Goliath is still alive. He is marching straight toward this kid. Massive, ferocious, invincible. And David just stands there, watching him. He hasn't done anything yet. He is right in the middle of making a choice. Step forward and possibly die a second later, or run away. If you start staring closely at the details, you will feel the adrenaline rush under your own skin. His body looks relaxed, only at first glance, from a distance. Step closer. Look at his face. His brow is furrowed so hard it forms a deep, angry crease right above his nose. His nostrils are flared, as if he's desperately gasping for hot air. His lips are tightly pursed, corners slightly downturned. This is the face of a man experiencing a toxic mix of absolute fury and primal, visceral fear. He's controlling that fear with sheer willpower, but his body gives him away. Take a look at his neck. His right jugular vein is swollen and bulging right out of his skin. In medicine, this phenomenon is well documented. The jugular vein distends under extreme physical strain, or when the heart is pounding at nearly 200 beats per minute from a massive rush of adrenaline. Michelangelo wasn't just sculpting a beautiful male figure, he was showing the physiology of stress. He chiseled into stone the exact way the human cardiovascular system reacts in a moment of mortal danger. And he did this 300 years before scientists would detail these processes in medical textbooks. How did a 26-year-old kid know these kinds of details? Michelangelo gathered this knowledge himself, through the most dangerous, horrific, and sinful method available at the time. Every night, as Florence fell asleep, the young sculptor sneaked into the basement of the Santo Spirito monastery. The local prior allowed him into the monastery morgue, where the bodies of the homeless, the destitute, and executed criminals were brought. Layer by layer, he dissected human corpses. He sliced open skin, exposed muscle tissues, and studied how tendons attach to bones and how veins wrap around joints. He would slide his fingers beneath muscle fibers to figure out exactly how they contract when a person raises an arm or turns their head. This wasn't just illegal. For performing these kinds of experiments on Christian bodies, you could easily end up at the stake of the Inquisition, executed for witchcraft and desecration of the dead. That is exactly why every inch of David's body breathes truth. His abdominal muscles are so tight you can feel the punishing strain on his core. The fingers of his left hand gripping the sling are tense to the absolute limit. The sculptor transferred to marble every single anatomical detail he had memorized in the chilling silence of that monastery morgue. But here we come back to our main paradox. If Michelangelo knew human anatomy with such fanatical, insane precision, if he remembered the location of every tiny ligament, how could he commit the wild mistakes we talked about at the very beginning? Why is the perfect David's right hand longer than his left, looking like a giant's claw? Why is his head way too massive for his torso? Why on earth did he make him cross-eyed? Remember the original plan of the patrons. The statue of David was never meant to stand in a brightly lit museum gallery at eye level for visitors. It was supposed to be hoisted up to an immense height, onto a buttress of the Florence Cathedral, about 80 meters off the ground. Michelangelo, being not just an artist but a brilliant mathematician, understood exactly how human vision works. If you make a human figure with mathematically flawless academic proportions and drag it up to a bird's eye view, it spells disaster for a spectator standing down on the square. Because of the laws of perspective, the massive height will visually eat up the upper part of the statue. The head will look tiny, the shoulders narrow, and the arms like short stumps. The statue would turn into an awkward, comical bobblehead. So Michelangelo goes ahead and intentionally distorts the proportions. He deliberately scales up the head and makes the right hand gigantic. He calculates the viewing angle from the ground up, so that from a distance of dozens of meters, these disproportions cancel each other out. To someone looking at the cathedral from the street, David would appear perfectly harmonious, powerful, and flawless. The exact same thing applies to the crossed eyes. If David's eyes were symmetrical and looked straight at the same point, his gaze would appear blank, glassy, and unfocused when viewed from below. The sculptor splits the optical axes of his eyes in different directions. One eye monitors the space directly ahead, while the other tracks the enemy to the side. Thanks to this trick, David's gaze gains an incredible, almost mystical intensity. And what about the missing muscle on his back? That happens to be the exact spot where Michelangelo had to wage war against a defect in the stone. Remember that hole left by the first sculptor 40 years prior? It hit right in the area of the right shoulder blade. There was physically no marble left in that spot. It was a void. Any other master would have given up. But Michelangelo improvises. He twists David's torso into a complex curve, a classic contrapposto, shifting the entire weight of the body onto the single right leg. The left leg is relaxed and stepped aside. The shoulders are angled. This maneuver allowed the sculptor to cast the defective area into shadow, masking the missing muscle with a natural fold of the pose, so perfectly that for centuries nobody even noticed, until scientists scanned every millimeter of the statue with a laser. But even these technical illusions pale in comparison to what happened when David was finally rolled out from behind the wooden fence. It was an explosion that nearly triggered street riots and forever changed the destiny of Florence. In January 1504, the city authorities convened a special committee. They needed to figure out how to hoist this 5-ton masterpiece onto the cathedral roof. The greatest minds of Italy gathered in the hall: Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, Filippino Lippi. They approach the statue, and a dead silence falls over the room. It becomes obvious to everyone. Hoisting this onto the roof would be a crime. First of all, technically it's incredibly dangerous. The cathedral stones might not support such a concentrated load. Second, and most importantly, David turned out way too monumental, too alive, and too terrifying to hide 80 meters up in the air where nobody could truly see him. The committee makes a decision. David belongs on the ground, right on the Piazza della Signoria, right in front of the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, the main government building of Florence. And this is where the quiet biblical boy transforms into the ultimate political weapon of the Republic. The context of the era was nothing but blood, intrigue, and warfare. Just a few years prior, Florence had violently kicked out its tyrants, the oligarchic Medici clan that had ruled the Republic for over half a century. The city declared itself a free, democratic republic. But enemies surrounded Florence on all sides. On one flank was the Pope with his troops. On the other were the exiled Medicis, gathering mercenary armies to reclaim power and punish the rebels. When David was placed in front of the government palace, they faced him south, pointing straight toward Rome. It was a direct, defiant, ballsy gesture. David was no longer just a shepherd from an ancient Jewish legend. He became a living metaphor for Florence itself, a small, proud republic that doesn't possess a massive professional army, standing stark naked before giant monsters, Rome and the Medici tyrants. He doesn't have a sword in his hands, but he has a sling, which stands for intellect, freedom, law, and cold calculation. The unveiling of David caused such a shock that the Medici loyalists still in the city got the hint without needing a translator. As the statue was being moved through the city streets, from the workshop to the square over the course of 4 days, on special wooden rollers pulled by 40 men, unknown saboteurs pelted it with stones under the cover of night. They were trying to smash it, deface it, chip the marble. The city had to assign a round-the-clock armed guard to the statue. There is one fantastic historical anecdote that perfectly captures Michelangelo's character and how he dealt with criticism from bureaucrats. Once David was installed in the square, Piero Soderini, the chief magistrate of Florence, came to inspect the work. This was a man with massive wealth and an even larger ego, who believed that because he was paying, he understood art better than anyone. Soderini paced around the statue for a long time, craning his neck, squinting, and finally blurted out, "You know, Michelangelo, it's great, but the nose. His nose is a bit too big. It ruins the whole profile. You should fix it." Any other artist in Michelangelo's shoes would have dropped to their knees, started apologizing, or launched into a furious argument, risking their commission and falling out of favor. But Michelangelo was way too smart for petty squabbles. He silently grabs his chisel in his left hand, covertly scoops up a handful of fine marble dust left in the cracks of the scaffolding, and climbs up the ladder, straight to David's face. The entire city below holds its breath. Michelangelo pretends to carefully tap his hammer against the chisel near the statue's bridge of the nose. In reality, he doesn't touch the stone by even a millimeter. He just discreetly lets the marble dust slip out of his fist. A little white cloud cascades beautifully right onto the head of the politician standing below. Soderini, brushing the dust off his expensive cloak, inspects David's profile with the air of a profound connoisseur and proudly declares, "Aha! Now that is a completely different story. Now you've corrected my mistake, and he looks truly alive." So, where is this clever and fierce David right now? Out there on the Piazza della Signoria, where the political passions of Florence once raged, a David still stands today. But it's a replica. They had to launch an emergency rescue operation for the original back in the 19th century. The stone, which had soaked under the rain for nearly 40 years before Michelangelo, ended up standing out in the open elements for over 3.5 centuries after him. At some point, the authorities realised that if they left it outside, the rain, wind, and harsh city smog would literally dissolve the masterpiece. In 1873, David was carefully relocated to the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. They built a massive, domed tribune hall specifically for him, where soft light streams down. But even within the walls of a protected museum, David continues his round-the-clock struggle for survival. That is no exaggeration. 5.5 tons of marble pushed down on his ankles every single day. A few years ago, scientists sounded the alarm after discovering dangerous microcracks around his left ankle. The reason is simple. The statue is gargantuan, as tall as a 2-story building, and it stands at a slight tilt. Meanwhile, the millions of tourists who come to look at it generate floor micro-vibrations with their footsteps. On top of that, the region is periodically shaken by minor tremors. To keep David from collapsing from the next echo of an earthquake, engineers designed a special anti-seismic pedestal that dampens any vibrations. Every year, over 1 million people buy tickets and line up in endless queues just to stand next to him for a few minutes. And you know what the most incredible part is? People don't go there just to check a box on a tourist itinerary or for a dry history lesson. They come to lock eyes with this giant. See you in the next episodes, where we will continue to crack the codes of great creators. Bye for now.